guess that's what they call it, the blues. I guess that's what they call it, the blues. I guess that's what they call it, the blues. I guess that's what they call it, the
Boo. Happy Halloween. Welcome to week 2, Zoom session for ED 720 curriculum class. Thank you all for coming back. I'm always comforted when the students return. And it's nice to see some faces and people I know. As usual, what I want to do is open with a few remarks and comments in relation to the course so far and some of the things that I've seen that you've posted. And then the bulk of our time will be with you having an opportunity to ask me questions if you have them. So let me launch. By the way, if you'll put...
hit record.
Am I not recording? Let me see here. Thank you.
Yes, I see it now.
Recording, it looks to me like I'm recording. Okay. Thanks, Jessica. So for a few comments, first, I think all of you brought, if you've looked in your Moodle message board, you saw that I sent to you a little bit of an update on Learning Task 5. I didn't articulate that well at all during week 1, and so I've cleaned that up a little bit. And in task 4 every week, I'm going to ask you to do a comparative analysis between 2 states. And as we've had conversations back and forth, and I think it's probably more apparent to you now than it was before, when you're comparing the states, you're probably looking specifically at standards versus standards. In Learning Task 5 every week, I'm going to ask you to do a comparative analysis between a couple of school districts. The first one you'll pick would be some school district from some state that begins with alpha A through M. And then you'll pick another school district from a state that begins with letter N through Z. My recommendation to you, you're probably going to want to fish at larger school districts because those folks have pretty robust teams, particularly curriculum instruction teams, and typically, not always, but typically they have their curriculum posted online. So it may result in a little more digging on your part. But I think when you see those district level curricula, and those of you that work in larger districts have already made some comments in relation to this. The state standards, you can think of that basically as the skeleton. And what school districts typically do is they use their CNI team, or as some of you have even indicated in your postings, they will recruit teachers from within their school districts that they believe that they deem to have some specialist capabilities, and they'll outsource that curriculum fleshing in, if you will, around the standards. The question that's been posed, can you use 2 districts within the same state? I would prefer that you do it from two different states so you can get a better feel for the different ways people approach it. On the topic of curriculum, and it appears from what I've seen in your chatter on the forum, and particularly in your responses so far that I've seen in Learning Task 2.1, your view of curriculum has broadened already, which I thought it would. Curriculum is a kind of a ubiquitous word. It can mean all and everything that has to do with teaching and learning, or it can be very, very narrow in scope. It's sort of like the word government. When we talk about government, it can be the great big booger man, or government can be your local school board. And so curriculum has that same sort of flexibility in its usage, if you will. At the end of the day, and I think most of you are picking up on this, the curriculum is either what is taught or what was intended to be taught. And as I mentioned to you last week, we typically, especially professional educators like us, frame it against the context of what's written versus what gets taught and versus what gets tested. Fenwick English, if you're interested in digging, especially those of you in the C&I program, if you're interested in digging a little deeper into the history and some of the pivotal thinkers in the field of curriculum, Dr. Fenwick English has a lot of work in that area that has influenced the thinking in our field for a long time. Someone asked if you could use curriculum maps, and absolutely you can. That's one way. Basically, that's a graphic representation. To Rob from Marzano's speak, curriculum maps is a representation of the curriculum. One way to view it. In fact, on that topic, if you want to dig a little deeper and learn some very interesting stuff about curriculum mapping, you can look and do a little research from the work of Dr. Heidi Hayes Jacobs. Hayes-Jacobs. She's a hyphenated woman. In your comments, I couldn't help but, especially in the discussion forum, I couldn't help but make the connection when you all got off onto the chasing the rabbit on the what Dr. Wilson called the concomitant curriculum, which is basically the curriculum, the stuff that children learn from home and from their environment, not necessarily from the educators. And it took my mind to the concept of culture, which those of you, particularly those of you in the leadership program, you'll hear me talk about this a lot in other classes. But even those of you in the C&I program, I mean, you're preparing yourself for higher levels of responsibility and levels of leadership, even if not in administration. Crafting a culture of learning on the campuses in which we work may be the most important work that you and I do as far as having a long-term staying power. And several of you referenced that concept that Dr. Wilson floated with us, that concept of null curriculum, the stuff that doesn't get taught officially. And so a lot of times, especially in the age of high-stakes accountability, what has resulted from a curriculum perspective, when the state and federal governments decided that they were going to be putting so much money into public education, in particular public education, they wanted some accountability to go with that. And so the typical process that took place was they would assemble blue ribbon teams of educators in all of the academic fields and ask them to come up with a set of standards for each of those fields. And you've been taking a look at those when you've been doing the state curriculum comparisons. The result of that, though, was when you gather up a bunch of English teachers and say, what should we make sure that every student learns about English from pre-K through 12 before they escape our control, you end up with a large volume of what that group of people deems to be a highly important content. And it just grows and grows and grows. And so when you think about that, and those of you that are teaching now, especially if you're teaching tested areas, you live with this reality every day. You end up with so many standards and so many curriculum requirements that it's virtually impossible, even within your own academic field, to completely cover all that content. Not to mention the fact that the same thing is happening in the sciences and in the mathematics and in the fine arts and in the career and technology. We tend to stay focused on the 4 core areas because those are the ones that are tested, and typically those are tested because they're the easiest things to measure. But that no curriculum issue is something that you and I deal with all the time. I deal with it in the delivery of the content of this course right here, because a typical full-length term course would be 15 or 16 weeks through a whole fall, in which I could provide you a lot more breadth of curriculum. So I had to make some decisions about what do I leave out? What gets left out? And you make the same decisions, most of you make the same decisions in your own classrooms all the time. But for an example, and I'm an old retired high school principal before I became a school superintendent. I don't know, those of you that teach science know this, but those of you that don't, the most current versions of the high school biology textbook probably weighs in the vicinity of 90 pounds. I think those books are probably going to have wheels on them like those trail behind luggage things in the future, because there's just so much that we know about biology, and we add to that knowledge base every year, every day, actually. Here's an important, interesting fact. I mentioned, those of you that took the graduate research class with me earlier, I probably mentioned this to you. But if not, it doesn't matter. You probably forgot it. But here's an interesting note. When you talk about the growth of knowledge and the growth of our understanding, 90% of all scientists that have ever lived are at work today. Let me say that again. 90% of all scientists that have ever lived are alive and working today. And so we have tons of research going on in all fields, the normal and customary fields that you and I are accustomed to, physics and chemistry and the mathematics and sciences, and social studies. But there are even other fields that you may not be aware of, fields like noetic science, the science of mind over matter. Look it up on the Google. It's a real thing. But all that research is going on right now, and it adds to our knowledge base across all content areas in very voluminous fashion. But in a school accountability system, when you're trying to decide what must those students know, what must they be able to do, and how must they be able to demonstrate it, there's just a whole lot there. And so what ends up when you start taking a look at those school district curricula, and some of you work in districts and probably have even been involved in this process. The term we typically use is called unpacking. They'll take the state standards and they'll unpack them. And basically what they're doing is they're going on a search to try to figure out what are the elements in the state standards that the students are going to be actually tested on. And we want to make sure that we focus our teaching on that. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing. In fact, I believe the contrary. Because what it does then goes back to that concept that you and I talked about last week on the effects of standardization. Last week I told you that it typically results in setting a floor on the learning, but a de facto ceiling on the learning. Another way to think of that is the standardization that results from our attempt to homogenize the learning experience ends up in a minimal experience for the student and the teacher, rather than an optimal learning experience for the student and the teacher. So not necessarily a good thing. In fact, I have to tone down my rants quite often. Now that I'm older, I can rant usually without letting my blood pressure go up. Let me go back to the issue of curriculum too, particularly that concomitant curriculum, that the stuff the students are learning that has nothing to do with us, the stuff they're learning from home or from their houses of faith or from their social groups. That's culture. And every one of us are a product of the culture in which we were raised, or the culture, in your case, in my case, the cultures, particularly the professional cultures that you and I choose to spend our time in. We cannot help but be impacted by that culture. And every culture has its own curriculum. Very few cultures have a written curriculum. Fewer still have a tested curriculum, although there's, whoever turn your mic on, if you'll turn it off, please. So you and I are not only are we impacted by the cultures, and I say that in the plural on purpose, because you and I are both impacted by the curriculum of the culture of the family in which we were raised, whether it was our natural family or an adopted family. And you're impacted by the culture of our faith community. And even if you're atheist, it takes a fair amount of faith to believe that. You and I are impacted by the social grouping community, the cultures of these communities, whether it's the bowling league we belong to, or the softball team, or the professional teacher organization. All those kinds of things have their own culture, which means they also have a curriculum by which they transmit their beliefs and values and knowledge from one generation to the next. On that topic, I know I'm rattling. I'll give you a chance to ask questions in a minute, but more and more districts around the nation, and several of you have alluded to this in your comments, particularly in the discussion forum, feeling a little bit frustrated at the didactic nature of the curriculum requirements, and you feel like that's at the expense of teaching the students to be good human beings and responsibility and those kinds of things. And in fact, that socio-emotional learning is, several of you have mentioned the swinging pendulum of the curriculum influences over the years. The socio-emotional learning component is making a real comeback. And in particular, there's some very large districts that are putting a lot of money where their mouth is on that topic, because they believe that it's not enough for Nelson to be a good mathematician and a good writer, that Nelson needs to know the elements of being a good citizen, and Nelson needs to understand the value of financial responsibility, and Nelson needs to understand the responsibility, the importance of providing service to your community. Now, all that fits under the framework of what we typically call socio-emotional learning. You're seeing more and more curricula being developed around that concept. I know for a fact that Austin ISD in Texas, which is one of our largest school districts, has invested a huge amount of money in trying to develop, and here's a kind of a catchphrase, trying to develop the whole child. And I'm all for it. Both of the school districts that I served as superintendents, we went through a very deliberate process in trying to decide what it was we wanted to teach our children. And when I had those conversations with our community members and our school board and our teachers and stuff, it was very painfully apparent that they wanted attention and effort placed on the development of the whole child in a lot of dimensions far beyond just academic prowess. On that topic, the concomitant curriculum of culture and its transmission from one generation to the next, or from one social group to another. There's a researcher by the name of Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, and I've mentioned him in other classes, who believes that transmission of culture through that concomitant curriculum occurs through a process that he calls morphogenic fields. That it's not something that's directly taught, but it's more the transmission of a set of habits and behaviors from one generation to the next. Very interesting study. He's not hard to find on the internet. Does a very interesting TED Talk, actually, that got banned. That's the surest way to get me to watch a TED Talk if it got banned. I want to know why it got banned. Jennifer says they unpack the standards and then create a list of essential standards that you want the students to master. Correct, and that happens in districts all over the nation, and typically that's done in the interest of raising test scores. So the argument that leaves space, I'm not going to say the argument, that leaves space open for the healthy dialogue of how much importance that we should be placing on the test scores for the students, and at what expense. What do we leave out of the curriculum, of all those different kinds of curriculum that you've learned about? What gets left out when you end up spending more time and more focus on particularly academic prowess, proficiency things? Tons of research all over the nation. Those of you that went through the grad research class saw some of this stuff. I'm seeing more and more research, particularly on people trying to bring back into the formal school day and the curriculum the fine arts, because those have suffered greatly at the expense of the high stakes accountability. I'm seeing more and more research on schools trying to increase the amount of recess for elementary school students in particular, or PE for the secondary school students, because they feel like the intense focus on the academic side, and typically what gets robbed is the fine arts and the health-related fields. And people feel like there's been a real price that's been paid for that trade-off. You know where you stand on that argument, and tonight's really not, I mean, when we get to the question and answer session, I'll be glad to entertain your thoughts on that. Many of you commented in the discussion forum and also in your responses, particularly in your responses to the videos, that the evolution of the SAT test was something that you were not familiar with, and the rather nefarious component of it being created in such a way to disaggregate children from a privileged environment from those from a non-privileged environment. And yes, that absolutely existed at the beginning of that process. It's been quite a battle over time to try to modify and change the SAT to be a less biased instrument. The same sort of struggles in trying to create authentic and assessments with high fidelity at the state level and even in district level. It's a real challenge. For instance, I live and about half of my years of service or have been in rural areas. And if you put an item on a test, whether it's SAT or local social studies test, if you put an item on there that has to do with how to access the subway, these students out here would be a distinct disadvantage because they've never even seen a subway. However, if you put a question on there about how to saddle a horse, then the students in the urban area would be at a distinct disadvantage. So that issue of authentic assessments that cut to the intelligence rather than the life experiences is a real challenge for those that make those exams. On that topic as well, I feel like I'm rattling like crazy. I'll shut up. I'll run out of gas here in a minute, and then y'all will be spared. But let me, at this moment, as we speak, there is a lawsuit making its way through the appellate courts right now. It will land in front of the Supreme Court. A group of Asian students have sued Harvard University because they were not allowed entry into Harvard, even though they had SAT scores that were far above the average of the students that were accepted into Harvard. Harvard and most of the universities in the nation have taken serious steps to try to embrace a broader diversity of students into their student bodies. And some universities have even abandoned the SAT exam completely, as well as the ACT exam. but almost all universities have reduced what they believe is the weight of the SAT on the entrance, in the interest of taking a much broader view of the entering student, in the interest of trying to create a more diverse student bodies. In particular, and I told you earlier, I was an old retired high school principal. I've seen over the last 20 years the college entrance requirements become far less focused on those college entrance exams. They're still there, but they don't have nearly as much weight. And those colleges and universities are putting far more weight on students' community service involvement, whether or not they were involved in extracurricular activities while they were in school, those kinds of things. The whole child, going back to the whole child sort of thing. When I was working on my master's degree like you are, and this would have been in the mid-90s, there was a book that was published by the title of The Bell Curve by a couple of guys named Herstein and Murray. And I was like you know, my professors were giving me tons of stuff to read, but the thing caught my attention because it made such a splash on the national media. And the two authors of the book were being just excoriated because what Herstein and Murray did is they took a look at the SAT and other standardized exams over the history of American education, and they said, yes, these different ethnic groups score at different rates on this exam. And what we have translated from that historically is that the higher score you make on the exam must mean that you're more intelligent. Herstein and Murray made the argument, no, that's not true. What happened is the tests were made to favor children of privileged environments. So consequently, they score higher. And then on these measures that we have chosen to measure, then they look smarter. They went on at the end of the book to make the point that unless and until we rethink the way we use standardized exams to try to sort and rank children, we're going to continue to create these fractions in the social fabric of our country. Really, they made a compelling argument for us to revisit and rethink the way we use those standardized exams. And because this made such a splash in the national media, it caused my skeptic meter to go up. Those of you that took graduate research with me understand that I'm very suspicious. So I thought, well, heck, I'm going to read the book. And I'd made that decision before I looked at how big the book actually was. It's a monster, almost big as those biology books. But in subsequent conversations that I've had over the years, even with professors in the universities that I've worked in, they have also wanted to go to the place to where Herstein and Murray were bigots. And I would look at them and I'd say, did you read the book? Well, no, but I heard a news report. And I'm going, follow the evidence, read the book, see what those guys said. Let me go on to another book that you may be interested in, because essentially what we're talking about at this point is a social justice. Another author that you might be interested in, if social justice is of interest to you, and this has everything to do with curriculum, is a guy named Jonathan Kozol, K-O-Z-O-L. He wrote a book back in the early 2000s by the title of Savage Inequalities, in which he looked at particularly education in portions of some of the most metropolitan areas of the United States, and saw huge inequities that had been intractable. We're talking about like South Chicago, Southeast St. Louis, there's some pockets of education areas that are almost like education deserts in this nation. And Kozol went in and looked and studied those areas, and he pointed out that there were huge inequities in the quality of education being delivered to those children, both versus children, particularly in the suburbs, in those metropolitan areas. Great book, and Kozol has written other things that I can recommend as well. I've never picked up anything that he's written that didn't just absolutely rivet me. One more book thing, because several of you mentioned in your comments from the history portion, your new learning on the impact of No Child Left Behind from the Bush administration, and then followed up with the Race to the Top in the Obama administration. But in particularly, the No Child Left Behind, and I was in the principal role at the time that came into being. The idea and the concept behind No Child Left Behind, like so many other things, was noble and worthy. I mean, the whole idea of leave no child behind, it's just almost impossible to argue against that. But the mechanisms that were put in place to try, basically it was the standardization around the concept of accountability, really ended up working in the opposite direction for some of the children that were most needy of supports. A person that was instrumental in crafting that No Child Left Behind legislation and trying to make that wagon roll was a lady by the name of Dr. Diane Ravitch, R-A-V-I-T-C-H. She's a prolific blogger. She's written several books, but she had a reversal, if you will, or an epiphany, after she saw how disastrous the implementation of No Child Left Behind was and the impact on students that really needed support the most. She did it was like, to use a biblical phrase, like a come to Jesus event in her life. And she did a complete 180, and she's been on the warpath ever since, fighting for a reduction in the standardization and accountability mechanisms that put so much pressure on teachers and cause us to forsake the education of the whole child at the expense of the education of the academic child. A book that she wrote that I can strongly recommend to you is by the title of Reign of Error. Copyright on that's 2013, if you care. Diane Ravitch is her name. Several of you noticed that how many states had adopted the Common Core when you did your state comparison. And a couple of you actually noted, and there's a few of you from Texas, like I am. Texas is one of those few states that did not adopt it, but I got one more for you here. Not only did Texas not adopt the Common Core, our state legislature enacted official legislation. It is the law of Texas that forbids any school district from using the Common Core. And that's all wrapped up in a political tit for tat, but it's an interesting side note nonetheless. I think you all can go now. Format, exactly the format from week 2. In the same format's going to happen as far as your learning tasks, your assignments go through all 7 weeks, even week 7. Although week 7 you got the final exam, but you're going to know what it is ahead of time, and it's not going to be anything that'll scare you. My recommendation to you is use this opportunity to fish at some different states. You know, I know you're all swamped. Most of you have full-time jobs. Even those that don't have full-time jobs, if you're not working for somebody's paycheck, you're busy trying to raise a family. But I encourage you to use the opportunity that you have here, since this old professor is making you do those searches anyway. Don't just look at the same state every week because it's handy and easy. Stretch your boundaries, take a look, see what you can find, and it'll make you a smarter, better educator, I think. I appreciate the fact that several of you have mentioned that your thinking has been stretched already. That was my intent. Malice aforethought. I try to craft learning tasks that push your thinking, that stretch your boundaries, that force you to consider other perspectives. And I think most of you probably already figured out that I'm conventional is probably not a word that fits me very well. As our colleague from the University of Virginia, Dr. Dan Willingham says, is the whole key to teaching is to get the students to think about the curriculum, to think about the content. And so I'm trying to design learning tasks to cause you to think. By the way, I said I was through with books, but no, I'm not. Dr. Willingham wrote a great book called Why Don't Students Like School? Why don't students like school? He's a cognitive neuroscientist, by the way. He's not a teacher. That's a great book for those of you that have book studies on your faculty. That's a great book for either administrative teams or faculties or departments or grade level teams to do a book study together. It's a really good view of the things that we do in the profession of education that are really not very conducive to causing the students to think deeper and more richly. Finally, for my comments, and then I'll start answering your questions if you have them. This whole thing about curriculum and the work that you and I are in this deep in is trying to cause learning to happen. And considering what's important enough for us to spend our time and our effort and our money teaching, regardless of which of those curricular streams it falls in. At the end of the day, what you and I teach our children, we teach their children. So it's critical that whatever we teach, we do so very intentionally. We pick the stuff we spend our time and our effort on very intentionally, because there's a legacy that lives long after they put you and I in the ground. Okay, sermon over. I'm going to shut up now and turn my attention to your questions if you have them. Let me take a quick scan of the chat box and see if I've got a question pending here. Thanks. Appreciate the compliments. You know, I think I've mentioned this to you all before. I've taught in a purely online version of school. I've taught in the purely face-to-face, and I've also taught in a blended format. I much prefer the blended format. I'd like to be in the same room with all of you. I can see your faces, most of you that have your camera on. But it's hard for me to get a good sense of what's going on between your ears through a camera. Gosh, I talked for a long time tonight. That's very unlike me, right, Andy? And here I'm keeping you all from trick-or-treating. Or maybe I'm trying to keep you off the streets. Okay. I'm going to give you just a few more seconds to ask questions if you got them. The link to last week's session, if you go into module 1 or week 1 module, it says Zoom session number 1. And what I've done is in that particular item, I've replaced the original instructions and said, here's the link to that session. So you just click on it and it'll start running my beautiful mug from last week. Caloric intake has begun. I saw on my Facebook page earlier today when my sister-in-law is a teacher, and she said something like, she posted it on there, something along the lines that prayers go out for every man and woman who has to teach school tomorrow. My wife is a retired elementary teacher, and good gosh almighty, those little rascals are going to be high as a kite tomorrow. And not just the teachers. Calorkin, here too, Andy, thank you. Okay, y'all are not asking me questions. I'm fixing to let you go. Happy hour. Okay. I love learning with you. Thanks for letting me join you on this journey. You know how to get hold of me. I'm fixing to turn it off, and I'll see you in cyberspace. Good night.